The Bishop of Mainz has openly acknowledged that lay people preach during Mass in his diocese, even as the Holy See has explicitly forbidden the practice, and he has stated plainly that he will not intervene to stop it. Bishop Peter Kohlgraf, speaking this week to Katholisch.de, the internal media outlet of the German Bishops' Conference, described lay preaching as something that has become common practice in his diocese, and declared that he would not sanction those who engage in it under canon law. This is not a rumor or a distortion. These are the bishop's own words, spoken publicly, in the aftermath of the direct instruction from Rome rejecting exactly this kind of arrangement. To understand why this matters, and why it touches something far deeper than a single German diocese, we have to look at what the homily actually is in the life of the Church, what the Church has consistently taught about who may preach it, and why the Holy See responded to the German bishops the way it did. The homily is not a speech. It is not a lecture, nor a personal reflection offered to fill time between the readings and the creed. According to the Vatican's Dicastery for Divine Worship, responding to the German bishops on June 17th of this year, the homily is an integral part of the liturgy of the Word, intrinsically bound to the proclamation of the Gospel, and it constitutes an exercise of the munus docendi, the office of teaching, that is entrusted specifically to ordained ministers through the sacrament of holy orders. That single sentence carries enormous weight, and it deserves to be unfolded slowly. The Church does not treat preaching at Mass as a talent to be distributed to whoever is eloquent or theologically trained. It treats it as an act flowing directly from ordination itself, from the configuration to Christ that a man receives when a bishop lays hands upon him. Before I continue, if this kind of careful look at what the Church actually teaches is something you value, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps this work reach others who are searching for the same clarity. Canon law states the matter without ambiguity. Among the forms of preaching, the homily, which is part of the liturgy itself, is reserved to a priest or deacon, and it holds a preeminent place. Bishop Kohlgraf himself acknowledged this. He admitted openly that he has no authority to grant permission for a lay homily, saying that canon law does not permit it, and that this remains, in his words, the diocese's basis. And yet, in the very same breath, he described a situation that stands in tension with that admission. He said that in some religious communities within his diocese, it is common for lay people to preach, and that he does not intend to change this. If he discovers it, he said, he will not intervene disciplinarily, nor will he impose canonical sanctions. He does not announce it, he does not permit it in principle, but he simply recognizes that this naturalized practice exists. This is a remarkable posture, and it is worth sitting with. Here is a bishop who concedes the law, concedes his own lack of authority to change it, and then declines to enforce it, treating a settled question of the universal church as a local custom to be quietly tolerated rather than corrected. To grasp why Rome takes this so seriously, we have to understand what the Church means when it speaks of the munus docendi, the teaching office. In Catholic theology, the bishop and the priest do not preach in their own name. The Second Vatican Council, in its dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, teaches that bishops, as successors of the apostles, receive from the Lord the mission to teach all nations, and that among the principal duties of bishops, the preaching of the gospel holds a preeminent place. The priest shares in this mission as a co-worker of the episcopal order. When a priest or deacon preaches the homily, he is not sharing his private opinions about the Scriptures. He is exercising an office that belongs to Christ the head, an office he was configured to at ordination. This is why the general instruction of the Roman Missal, the very document that governs how the Mass is celebrated, reserves the homily to the priest celebrant, or, in specific cases, to a deacon or concelebrating priest, never to a layperson. The homily is woven into the sacred action itself, not appended to it. Now, none of this diminishes the gifts of the laity. The Church has always affirmed that lay people have a genuine and irreplaceable vocation. Lumen Gentium devotes an entire chapter to the laity, teaching that they share in the priestly, prophetic, and kingly office of Christ through baptism, and that they are called to sanctify the world from within. The laity can catechize, can teach in schools, can lead prayer groups, can evangelize in the workplace and the home in ways that no priest could. Bishop Kohlgraf himself called theologically qualified lay pastoral workers a richness of the Church. And in that specific judgment, he is entirely correct. The question the Church places before us is not whether the laity are gifted. The question is far more precise. Does the specific liturgical act of the homily situated within the Mass and flowing from the ordained office belong to that lay vocation? And the answer the Church gives, consistently in canon law and in liturgical instruction, is no. The distinction is not about worth, it is about the nature of the act itself. This is where the situation in Germany becomes something more than a local disciplinary matter, because it reveals a deeper pattern of how the Church's teaching is being received, and in some places, quietly set aside. Let us look at what has actually happened and why the response from Rome carried the weight it did. Bishop Kohlgraf was consecrated a bishop in 2017 and has led the Diocese of Mainz since that same year. He has publicly supported some of the more contested elements of the German synodal way, the sprawling reform process that has, among other things, called for married priests and for blessings of same-sex couples. His comments on lay preaching did not arise in a vacuum. They came directly in response to the Holy See's rejection of a formal request. On June 23rd, the Vatican made public its June 17th reply to the German bishops, who had asked for an indult, a special dispensation, that would permit lay preaching at Mass. The Dicastery for Divine Worship declined the request, grounding its refusal precisely in the theology we have been examining, that the homily belongs to the liturgy of the Word, is bound to the proclamation of the Gospel, and is an exercise of the teaching office entrusted to ordained ministers. Rome did not invent a new rule. It restated what canon law already holds, and what the liturgical tradition has consistently maintained. Bishop Kohlgraf's response was to accept the letter of the instruction, while declining its enforcement. He argued that for his diocese, the prohibition on lay preaching changes nothing in concrete pastoral practice. His greater concern, he said, was that the prohibition coming from Rome would now encourage denunciation. That is, that people might report those who continue to preach illicitly. He noted that his diocesan liturgical commission had published a handbook the previous year outlining the various other forms of proclamation that canon law does permit, and he affirmed his support for all of those permitted forms. Speaking of a hypothetical future, indult for lay preaching, the very thing Rome had just refused, he said such a thing would be good and appreciated, but that he alone could not decide it. In other words, he positioned himself as sympathetic to the reform, deferential to Rome in principle, and unwilling to act against the practice in fact. And he is not alone, which is precisely why this cannot be dismissed as one bishop's idiosyncrasy. At the end of July, in the Archdiocese of Munich and Freising, a laywoman delivered a joint dialogue sermon at the feast of St. Mary Magdalene, standing alongside an auxiliary bishop. Bishop Wolfgang Bischoff joined Theresia Reichel, the head of the Archbishop's Women's Commission, to deliver this dialogue sermon in what was, by any plain reading, a public and direct violation of the Vatican's instruction issued only weeks earlier. This was not a quiet custom tucked away in a small religious community. It was a bishop himself participating, publicly, at a feast day Mass, in the very act Rome had just declared impermissible. When we consider Kohlgraf's tolerance and Bischoff's active participation together, a pattern comes into focus, one in which the clear teaching of the universal church is treated by some as negotiable, and in which the line between lawful development and open disobedience grows blurred. The newly elected president of the German Bishops' Conference, Bishop Heiner Wilmer, is himself a committed advocate of the lay preaching movement, and his election was widely read as a signal to Rome about the conference's firm intentions on a range of questions. The concern raised by observers is straightforward. His leadership may force the Holy See to respond with greater firmness than it has shown so far, because otherwise the Vatican risks being seen as issuing instructions it will not or cannot enforce, instructions stripped of real authority. This is the quiet crisis beneath the surface of a story about who may speak after the gospel. It is a question about whether the teaching of the Church binds, or whether it becomes a suggestion that each region may honor or ignore according to its own preferences. If you find this kind of honest examination worthwhile, please consider subscribing. It costs you nothing and helps keep this work going. So how should we, as Catholics seeking to think with the Church, hold all of this? The tradition of the Church offers us a way to reflect that avoids both indifference and mere outrage, and it is worth walking through carefully. First, we must be clear about what is and is not open to debate. Whether the laity are valuable is not in question. The Church has answered that resoundingly, and the answer is yes. Whether the specific liturgical homily is reserved to the ordained is also not, at present, an open question. Canon law and the recent Vatican response treat it as settled. This is an important distinction, because charitable reflection requires that we not confuse the two. When Bishop Colgraf praises lay pastoral workers, he speaks a truth the Church affirms. When he declines to enforce the reservation of the homily, he steps away from a discipline the Church has just reaffirmed. Both things can be true at once, and holding them together honestly is part of thinking with the mind of the Church rather than reducing everything to sides. Second, the tradition invites us to consider why obedience in liturgical matters is not a small thing. The liturgy is not the property of any priest, bishop, or community. The Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium from the Second Vatican Council, teaches that no person, not even a priest, may add, remove, or change anything in the liturgy on his own authority. This is a striking principle, and it applies as much to a bishop in Mainz as to anyone else. The reason is not bureaucratic control. It is that the liturgy belongs to the whole Church, and it expresses a faith that we receive rather than construct. When the reservation of the homily to the ordained is quietly set aside, something is communicated, however unintentionally, about whether the sacred action is ours to shape as we see fit. The Church's insistence here is an act of protection. It guards the liturgy from becoming a mirror of local preferences and keeps it a gift handed on intact. Third, we might reflect honestly on the pastoral concern Bishop Colgraf raised, the fear that the prohibition would encourage denunciation. There's a real human dimension here worth acknowledging. No one wishes to see communities turned into places of suspicion or accusation, yet the answer the tradition would offer is not to leave a clear norm unenforced, but to teach it with clarity and charity, so that the faithful understand why it exists and embrace it rather than resent it. The remedy for a poorly understood law is better teaching, not quiet abandonment. When a norm is simply ignored, it does not disappear. It festers, and the resulting confusion often does more harm to communion than the norm itself ever could. This is why Rome's insistence, far from being rigid, can be understood as a form of care, a refusal to let a settled question drift into permanent ambiguity. Finally, this whole episode places before each of us a question worth sitting with in prayer. How do we receive the teaching of the Church when it does not align with what we would prefer? It is easy to obey when obedience is comfortable. The deeper test comes when the Church asks something that runs against the current of our own time, our own instincts, our own sense of what would be more inclusive or more modern. The saints consistently show us that the path of holiness runs through humble reception of the Church's authority, not around it. St. Ignatius of Loyola wrote in his Rules for Thinking with the Church that we ought to be ready to defend her teaching rather than to attack it. That disposition of receiving before judging, of trusting that the Church's discipline safeguards something precious, is not weakness. It is the posture of a soul that believes Christ genuinely guides his Church through the offices he established. When the Church addresses the question of who may preach the homily during Mass, it might at first appear to be a narrow matter of rules and permissions. Yet beneath this question lies one of the most profound realities of Catholic life, the nature of the sacred liturgy itself, the meaning of holy orders, the dignity of the lay vocation, and the way the faith is received and handed on across generations. This catechesis seeks to explain, clearly and simply, what the Catholic Church teaches on these matters, drawing on sacred scripture, the documents of the Second Vatican Council, the Code of Canon Law, and the constant tradition of the Church. The goal is not controversy, but understanding, that we might grasp the wisdom behind the Church's teaching and receive it with peace. The first thing we must understand is that the homily is not a speech inserted into the Mass, nor a lecture, nor a personal reflection offered to fill time between the readings and the creed. The Church teaches that the homily is an integral part of the liturgy of the Word. It is woven into the sacred action itself, not appended to it. The general instruction of the Roman Missal, which governs how the Mass is celebrated, describes the homily as necessary for nourishing the Christian life and explains that it should develop some point of the readings or another text of the Mass, always taking into account the mystery being celebrated and the needs of the listeners. This means the homily is intrinsically bound to the proclamation of the gospel. It is not a separate event. It flows directly from the Word of God just proclaimed. When the priest or deacon preaches, he is continuing the very act of proclamation that the readings began. The word is proclaimed, and then it is broken open and applied to the lives of the faithful. This unity between the gospel and the homily is why the Church treats the homily with such seriousness, and why it does not consider preaching at Mass to be interchangeable with other forms of religious instruction. The homily as an exercise of the teaching office. The heart of the Church's teaching on this matter is found in the concept of the munus docendi, the office or charge of teaching. This is a phrase worth understanding well because it explains everything that follows. In Catholic theology, bishops are the successors of the apostles. The Second Vatican Council, in its dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, paragraph 25, teaches that among the principal duties of bishops, the preaching of the gospel holds a preeminent place. Bishops are heralds of the faith who bring new disciples to Christ, and they are authentic teachers endowed with the authority of Christ himself. The priest shares in this mission as a co-worker of the episcopal order. When a priest is ordained, he receives a share in this teaching office, so that his preaching is not merely his own private word, but an exercise of a mission he has received. This is the crucial point. When a priest or deacon preaches the homily, he does not speak in his own name or share only his personal opinions about Scripture. He exercises an office that belongs to Christ the teacher, an office to which he was configured through the sacrament of holy orders. At his ordination, hands were laid upon him, and he was set apart to act in the person of Christ the head. The homily, therefore, is not simply the fruit of study or eloquence. Though study and eloquence are good and helpful, it is an act that flows from ordination itself. Because of this, the Code of Canon Law states the matter without ambiguity. Canon 767, paragraph 1, teaches that among the forms of preaching, the homily is preeminent, that it is part of the liturgy itself, and that it is reserved to a priest or deacon. This is not an arbitrary restriction. It follows directly from the theological reality that the homily is an exercise of the teaching office conferred through holy orders. The reservation of the homily to the ordained is the practical expression of a deeper truth about the sacrament of the priesthood. It would be a serious misunderstanding to conclude from this teaching that the Church regards the laity as less important, or that lay people have no genuine role in proclaiming the faith. Nothing could be further from the truth, and the Church has taught the dignity of the lay vocation with great force and clarity. Lumen Gentium devotes an entire chapter to the laity. In paragraph 31, it teaches that the lay faithful, through their baptism, are made members of Christ and share in his priestly, prophetic, and kingly office. Their vocation is to seek the kingdom of God by engaging in temporal affairs and directing them according to God's will, to sanctify the world from within as leaven in the dough. This is a genuine and irreplaceable calling. Lay people can catechize, teach in schools and parishes, lead prayer groups, evangelize in their families and workplaces, offer testimony to the faith, and serve the Church in countless ways that no priest could accomplish alone. The Church genuinely treasures theologically qualified lay people who dedicate their gifts to her service. There are many permitted forms of proclamation and preaching outside the Mass in which lay people may fittingly participate. Canon law itself makes provision for lay people to be admitted to preach in a church or oratory under certain circumstances, when necessity or usefulness requires it, according to the norms established by the Bishops' Conference, though this always excludes the homily at Mass. So the question the Church places before us is not whether the laity are gifted or valuable. The answer to that question is a resounding yes. The question is far more precise. Does the specific liturgical act of the homily, situated within the Mass and flowing from the ordained office, belong to the lay vocation? And the answer the Church consistently gives, in canon law, in liturgical instruction, and in her constant practice, is that it does not. The distinction is not about the worth of persons. It is about the nature of a particular act and its intrinsic connection to holy orders. There is a further principle that illuminates this entire question, and it is one of the most important truths in Catholic worship. The liturgy is not the private property of any priest, bishop, community, or region. The Second Vatican Council, in its Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, paragraph 22, section 3, teaches a principle of striking clarity. No other person, not even a priest, may add, remove or change anything in the liturgy on his own authority. This applies to everyone, from the newest layperson to the most senior bishop. The reason is not bureaucratic control or a love of rules for their own sake. The reason is that the liturgy belongs to the whole Church, and it expresses a faith that we receive rather than one we construct. This is a profound spiritual truth. The liturgy is a gift handed down to us. In the Mass, we do not gather to express ourselves or to create something new that reflects our own preferences. We enter into something that comes to us from Christ through the Church, something far greater than ourselves. When we approach the liturgy with the awareness that it is received rather than invented, we are protected from the temptation to make worship a mirror of our own tastes and opinions. The Church's insistence on fidelity in liturgical matters is therefore an act of protection. It guards the liturgy so that it remains a gift for all, handed on intact from generation to generation. Some may ask why the Church insists so firmly on these matters when the intention behind a particular practice might be good. Here the Church's wisdom offers a helpful reflection. When a clear norm is quietly set aside or left unenforced, it does not simply disappear. Instead, confusion grows. Different communities begin to follow different practices, and the unity that the liturgy is meant to express begins to fracture. The history of the Church shows that the remedy for a poorly understood law is not to abandon it, but to teach it with clarity and charity, so that the faithful come to understand why it exists and embrace it willingly rather than resent it. Good teaching, not quiet neglect, is the path to genuine unity. The Church's discipline in liturgical matters exists to preserve the communion of the faithful and to safeguard the treasure of worship that belongs to all. This teaching, finally, places before each of us a question worth carrying into prayer. How do we receive the teaching of the Church when it does not align with what we would prefer? It is easy to obey when obedience is comfortable and agreeable. The deeper test of faith comes when the Church asks something that runs against the current of our own time, our own instincts, or our own sense of what would be more convenient or more modern. The saints show us consistently that the path to holiness runs through the humble reception of the Church's authority, not around it. To receive before judging, to trust that the Church's discipline safeguards something precious, to believe that Christ truly guides his Church through the offices he established, this is not weakness or blind submission. It is the mature posture of a soul that trusts the Lord who promised to remain with his Church until the end of the age. The question of who may preach the homily opens, in the end, onto a much larger and more beautiful truth. The homily flows from the ordained office because it flows from Christ the teacher himself. The liturgy is not ours to reshape according to our preferences because it is a gift we receive rather than a work we construct. And the vocation of every member of the Church, ordained and lay alike, is to receive this gift faithfully, to treasure it, and to hand it on undiminished to those who come after us. When we understand these truths, the Church's teaching ceases to appear as a mere set of restrictions and reveals itself as what it truly is, a loving safeguard of the sacred, an invitation to humility, and a call to trust that the Lord who established his Church continues to guide her still. May we receive that teaching with peace, and may it draw us ever closer to the heart of Christ present in the liturgy of his Church. The story of a German bishop declining to enforce a Roman instruction is, in the end, a small window onto a very large question, whether the faith is something we receive and hand on faithfully, or something each generation and region reshapes to its liking. The Church's answer, reaffirmed in the June response of the Dicastery for Divine Worship, is that the homily flows from the ordained office because it flows from Christ the teacher himself, and that this is not ours to renegotiate. What remains open, and what the coming years will reveal, is whether that teaching will be received or quietly resisted in the dioceses where it is being tested right now. Thank you for spending this time in reflection. If this examination helped you understand the Church a little more deeply, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who might benefit. And may God bless you and keep you close to the heart of his Church.